one of the other things we see from the research for kids who eventually go on to have that diagnosis are having really challenging behaviors early on, even beginning at 2 years old, where they're having showing a lot of the impulsivity. So that hyperactivity, that impulsivity seems to be excessive amounts of that are those kids are more at risk for having ADHD later on. So again, it's, hitting excessively or biting excessively or, throwing things or just more of those aggressive behaviors in kids tend to be one of the things that we see in younger kids.
We are the Childhood Collective, and we have helped thousands of overwhelmed parents find joy and confidence in raising their child with ADHD. I'm Katie, a speech-language pathologist.
And I'm Lori.
And I'm Mallory, and we're both child psychologists. We combine the science of ADHD with the compassion of moms and bring you practical tools you can start using today.
So hit subscribe and let's help your family shine with ADHD.
Have you ever wondered if that sweet, funny, impulsive, enthusiastic child you're raising is just living their best preschool life, or if they might have attention difficulties? Because if you have, you are not alone. Many of the patterns and behaviors of ADHD are really common in kids in early childhood, even kids who don't have ADHD. So it can be hard to know. Not surprisingly, a question we get from parents all the time is, does my preschooler have ADHD? So today I'm talking with Lori and Mallory about the early signs of ADHD. So ladies, as child psychologists, you have lots of experience walking with families as they go through the evaluation process. What are some of the things parents are noticing at a young age?
Yeah, so we do. We have lots of kids that are coming in, and parents are noticing things with their behaviors. So a lot of times it's just they're moving constantly. They are running and climbing all the time. Everything they see is a jungle gym.
Yes.
They're switching from one activity to the next. Like I'm over here on Legos for 2 seconds, and then I'm off doing this, and I'm just dumping all the toys out, having all the emotions. So the tantrums are kind of one of the biggest things we hear from parents, where their kids have to leave a play date, and their kids have excessive meltdowns, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, where they're just really upset, and it's hard to transition out of those activities. And again, as parents, that is so hard for us and so embarrassing when you're in public and those things happen.
Absolutely. I was wondering if you were maybe at a play date with my kids. This might
actually, I was just talking about your kids when they came over last week. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh man,
totally
okay.
Not. Yep. Or just having a really hard time calming their body to go down for sleep at night. I mean, sleep is such a huge struggle for so many parents, where they're like, it is not normal for my preschooler who should be getting like 11, 12 hours of sleep at night. They're up until 10 and they cannot wind down. We cannot get them to sleep. And then they're up early in the morning, or they're up in the middle of the night. So these are a lot of the things that parents are coming to us really having a hard time with.
Got it. So that's interesting that you kind of named those things, because it also seems to me like some of the things you described are things we see in a lot of kids. And so for parents who are listening, like, how would they know when it's time to get that evaluation?
And so that's a really good question. And that's the tricky part about ADHD, is a lot of the early signs of ADHD are things that we see in a lot of preschoolers and a lot of toddlers. The short attention span, moving between activities quickly, having a lot of energy. And so it's tricky. And at what point do we become concerned?
Yeah.
If some of these things are so normal in preschool, but when is it not normal? And so what we say is like, it's normal until it's not anymore. And what we mean by that is the frequency that you're observing these things, or the intensity of these things that you're observing, is a big piece when we're looking at, are we looking at ADHD, or is this just typical preschooler, early childhood behavior?
And I think of meltdowns, for instance, like all kids with all preschoolers are going to have meltdowns here and there. And that's totally normal to have tantrums, but many young kids will be over it in a minute or 5 minutes. But if they're happening all day long, or they're taking really long periods of time to get over those things, that can kind of be a sign.
Exactly. So it's typical, it's normal until it's not, right? Because it's happening so often, the intensity is so big. And what we would expect with children who are typically developing is over time, they're going to age out of a lot of these early childhood common behaviors. Again, the short attention span, the extra activity, the tantrums. We expect to see kids aging out of those as they get older, as they start kindergarten, move into first grade. However, kids with ADHD, some of those things linger. They don't go away. The hyperactivity doesn't go away. The short attention span, or having trouble focusing on tasks that are boring or hard, that doesn't go away as they get older. So we see those signs continuing past early childhood into those elementary school years. And so this is part of the reason that we generally don't diagnose ADHD before 4. Again, because so many of those behaviors are typical in very early childhood. So the earliest generally we're making a diagnosis of ADHD is 4 years old. And there's actually a lot of practitioners who don't want to diagnose it until even later, 5 or 6 years old, because they want the child to have some kind of formal schooling experience where we say, we're seeing these signs at home, we're seeing these signs at school. My child hasn't aged out of it. They're 6 years old now, kindergarten's gone. Now they're heading into first grade. That's when we're really starting to look at, okay, at this point, we can really make a solid diagnosis of ADHD but if we're still seeing these signs.
Yeah, and even at age 4, I have lots of families who will come in as early as 4. And if your child is in a pre-K or a preschool program at that time, they're, again, they see kids on a regular basis, lots of kids, and those teachers and the administrative staff at the preschool can really identify, like, if this is kind of normal biting or hitting or things that happen, or if it's excessive and it really is impacting the environment at that preschool or at that pre-K to a point where they're like, there's something else going on. And they're usually good reporters of things like that.
Absolutely. So to your point, Lori, it can be diagnosed earlier, but it's not uncommon for families to bring these concerns to a professional when their child is 4 and get some pushback saying, oh, your kid's too young, we can't look at it yet, which is not necessarily the truth, especially if the signs are very intense, impacting your child at home and at school, causing big problems. Your child's getting kicked out of preschool. So it can be diagnosed earlier, but we hear from families all the time saying that their pediatrician, the school is telling them that their child is too young for that ADHD diagnosis. So it does happen.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And I think of it too when we talk about like those behaviors and, the impulsivity and moving quickly, but I also think of the executive functions that are not developing at that age. And so kids who struggle with like still finding their stuff, keeping things organized, those are some things where we might see the kids are struggling to learn those skills and acquire those executive functions. And school really is the first time for a lot of kids that they're going to really be faced with that, like keeping their desk organized and that kind of thing. So that makes a lot of sense. Well, we've kind of hit on a few different things, but just generally for parents who have these kind of questions, what are some of the signs that you as professionals would be looking for in an evaluation? What would be some of those things you're kind of looking to see what's going on?
Yeah, so I think some of it is stuff that we already kind of talked about, moving quickly from one activity to another, having a very short attention span for tasks, even tasks that are fun or toys that are fun, where they're moving from one thing to the next. Talking a lot. And we hear this about girls a lot, or females with ADHD talking excessively, or being extra social at school. And
we don't know anybody like that, right?
Katie over here.
Yeah, they're thinking of me right now, guys. They're just checking the boxes.
Making lots of noises. This is one where parents get so frustrated sometimes because their kids are making noises constantly in the car.
The car is such a trigger for me. Like the noise in the car, I don't know what it is, but I feel like I'm at that age where I have to like turn down the radio when I'm in traffic because I need to be able to see better. And I can't, like, my kids are still so loud in the back seat. And I'm like, guys, this is so dangerous.
I'm also like stressed in the car now.
Yes.
Now that I have kids, I'm just always like I have these visions of like something bad happening. This is my
Mhm.
anxiety, but I have like a higher level of stress with the
Yep.
kids in the car anyway, like worrying that we could get in an accident on a freeway. So I'm like really trying to focus.
Yep.
And yeah, that just,
And then they're
it's a
making
lot.
all the noise. And the most recent thing my kids do is they think that Teslas, we have a Tesla, but they are scared of Teslas. So we'll be driving and they'll be like, Mom, can you lose the blue Tesla behind us? And I'm like, no, we're on the freeway. So yeah, there's a lot happening in the car. So
Noises
yes.
in the car are really hard,
Yes.
loud. And my husband like has major sensory issues at home. So just the loudness all the
Yes.
time, 24 hours a day, is really hard for
Mhm.
families. Lots of climbing and running excessively, jumping up and down, high energy. And parents talk about like they're in a play date and they can kind of see their kids just like the energy ramping up to a point where it then becomes aggressive with other kids. Not that they're wanting to hurt other kids, they're
Right.
just becoming super impulsive and they dysregulated and they cannot get it back together. Again, big emotions are not a part of the diagnosis for ADHD, but fortunately, we've started to recognize that almost every family deals with this. So even in our rating scales, a rating scale I use when I'm making a diagnosis of ADHD that parents will complete on their kids' behavior, they just updated it and it includes emotional regulation because, again, it's such a huge concern for a lot of families. So when those tantrums or meltdowns are happening over and over and over again throughout the day, or they're excessive to the point where it's just taking a very long time for them to get over them, those are things that we're kind of looking for as professionals when we're talking to parents.
That makes sense. Definitely. And another note too is the speech and language piece. So I know that a lot of parents come in to see me as a speech pathologist. That's one of the first evaluations that they'll often seek out with their really young kids. They might not, take their 18-month-old to a psychologist, but they're very comfortable to come and see a speech therapist and get that eval. And so we do know from the research that a lot of kids with ADHD, oftentimes the research would say up to 2/3, even up to 90% of kids with ADHD do have, speech or language challenges that are also co-occurring. So that can be another early sign. But that's not to say there's a lot of kids who have speech or language challenges that do not have ADHD. So that I would say that's not like a hard, fast rule, but something to note, like if your child was a late talker, those types of things, that can also be something just to keep an eye on. And most likely if you're seeking out that therapy, you've already kind of got your head around that there might be other things that are going on. So when we're thinking about parents of really young kids, I know a lot of the signs we're talking about today are common in all kids until they're not. I love that. And then are there any signs that parents can look for that are more specific to ADHD to really distinguishing if they need to seek out this evaluation?
So one of the things that we've learned through research and also I think in our own personal experience talking with families is that kids with ADHD are more likely, especially in early childhood, to have sleep challenges. And Lori kind of already touched on this, but a lot of kids with ADHD struggle with falling asleep, staying asleep, and then staying awake during the day, especially if you didn't have good sleep all night. So, they bring all the energy to bedtime. Their mind is racing, maybe their body is still racing. A lot of kids with ADHD have a hard time calming their bodies, going to sleep, closing their eyes. Kids with ADHD are more likely to wake during the night and have a hard time falling back asleep. And because of those challenges, sleeping during the night and maybe early waking, they're also more likely to deal with daytime drowsiness. So again, as Katie said, with the speech language difficulties, if your child, if you have a preschooler and they're struggling with sleep, that doesn't mean that they're for sure going to have a diagnosis of ADHD. But what the research tells us is that kids who eventually get a diagnosis of ADHD were more likely in childhood to have sleep struggles. And we see those sleep challenges persisting past early childhood as well. Sleep is a really hard piece for kids with ADHD.
Over the past year, my oldest has really struggled with anxiety, especially at night. As soon as it was time for sleep, she'd be crying for me to stay and worrying about all the things. I was talking to another therapist about our bedtime battles, and she said the Zenimal, a screen-free meditation device, had been a game changer for her daughter with ADHD and anxiety. I immediately purchased the Zenimal and can confidently say it was the best tool to help my daughter get better sleep. She was able to fall asleep an hour earlier using it.
Yes, it's actually really helped my kids to be able to calm their busy bodies at night.
What we love about the Zenimal is that it combines two of our favorite bedtime recommendations, using a relaxation strategy and removing screens from the bedroom.
The Zenimal is an adorable screen-free turtle with 9 guided meditations your kids can choose from. And our absolute favorite part of the Zenimal is that every meditation ends with the most important message: you're a good kid.
To grab your own Zenimal and get your child and yourself some better sleep, head to Zenimals.com and use our code TCC for a discount. You can also find the link in the show notes. One of the other things we see from the research for kids who eventually go on to have that diagnosis are having really challenging behaviors early on, even beginning at 2 years old, where they're having showing a lot of the impulsivity. So that hyperactivity, that impulsivity seems to be excessive amounts of that. Those kids are more at risk for having ADHD later on. So again, it's hitting excessively or biting excessively or, throwing things or just more of those aggressive behaviors in kids tend to be one of the things that we see in younger kids. The other thing is, again, having a family history of ADHD. ADHD is one of the most highly inherited diagnoses from family members. And so as someone who evaluates for ADHD, I'm always making sure that I'm asking, is there a family history? Did, especially, dads and moms, did they have a diagnosis of ADHD early on? Is there a sibling that also has that diagnosis? Because we know that places them at an increased risk for also having that diagnosis.
I think something that we hear a lot from families when we're doing evaluations and we ask this question is like, well, no, but he's a lot like I was as a kid, or he's a lot like Uncle Joe. So definitely we hear very commonly from families, even if there wasn't a formal diagnosis, parents know like exactly. Generally, there is some kind of family history that they can pinpoint, even if it's not a formal diagnosis.
Yeah, I was just talking to a family the other day, and the dad was like, he was just like me. I was in the middle school principal's office, like literally every day. And it's hard because, I talk with a lot of families, like, we didn't have the same mental health accessibility that we do now. And so a lot of people who are our age, didn't necessarily get a diagnosis when you were younger. I know, like my mom, I was just talking with her, my older brother has ADHD and he didn't get a diagnosis until high school. And she just was like, I wish I had known about it, but no one talked about these things. So there are lots of people that, maybe didn't get a diagnosis, but even asking about that history of like, were you on an IEP, when you were younger? Did you get services at school, or were you getting therapies or other types of things that might be indicators that there was something similar going on within the family?
And we're just hearing this so much from moms, sending us messages, sending us emails, is that their child's diagnostic journey has set them on a diagnostic journey of their own. And it's not until the point of seeking out a diagnosis for their child that kind of the light bulb goes off. And they're, the person who's doing the evaluation is asking all these questions about their child and what school like. And they're suddenly at this reflection point where they're like, oh my gosh, I need to get evaluated. Like, they're putting all these puzzle pieces together and they recall their childhood and things were challenging. And maybe someone said they were spacey or daydreamy, or they knew they were smart, but why couldn't they perform as well as, their best friend? So
are you talking about me? She just described me, but that's okay.
Yeah. So, oftentimes a child's diagnostic journey is the catalyst for a parent's diagnostic journey.
Mhm.
So it's an interesting time for families. It's a roller coaster.
It is a roller coaster. And yeah, we see a lot of families that after we get done with their child's diagnosis, the parents are, saying, okay, it's time for me to go into and get some of those supports. And that's also too, because it's extremely hard to parent a child with ADHD when you also have ADHD. And that's a whole nother layer and element of struggle. And many of our parents listening are in that situation. So sometimes it is really helpful to get that diagnosis and also get the supports you need to be able to be a better parent for your child too.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. I think that's a huge piece of the puzzle, is that awareness of your own experience and how that affects how we parent.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking of families that are listening and they're thinking, okay, my child actually checks a lot of those boxes. What would you recommend as a first step for families? Like if they suspect ADHD, it can be so overwhelming. Where should they start?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we've been talking a lot about what we do in an evaluation, but how do families even get to that point, right?
Exactly.
Of getting to the evaluation process. And a great first step is to talk to your child's pediatrician. Bring up your concerns, what you've been noticing, what's challenging. Let them know if there's a family history of ADHD. There's a whole host of possible responses that can come from the pediatrician. They may help you get the diagnosis. They may do that themselves. Some pediatricians are comfortable with that. They may refer you to a specialist, so they may refer you to a child psychologist. They may tell you they want to wait and see. There's a whole host of different responses that could come from sharing that with the pediatrician, but that's generally a great first step. You can also contact your local school district or early intervention program. Your child can get an evaluation free of charge and potentially qualify for some free early childhood services.
It's important to know, though, in those evaluations, they're doing kind of a general evaluation of different developmental areas, and social, emotional, behavior functioning is a part of that. But if you go through a school district, they're not going to diagnose ADHD. They're more going to be looking at, are these, challenges, not developmentally appropriate for their age, and do they need services and interventions and goals to help support them. And they might even be able to provide, again, if they do qualify, free preschool services to assist.
Yeah, that's a really important point. The school district early intervention, their goal is not a diagnosis of ADHD. Their goal is to get your child services as early as possible, because we know that children who are supported earlier, have a more positive trajectory with their development. So their goal is to identify whether your child needs extra support, set them up for success upon kindergarten entry. If you get that wait and see response from your child's pediatrician, but your gut is telling you that there's something there, you don't want to wait and see, you want more support now, you can seek out the support of a child psychologist or a therapist, potentially get that diagnosis. If your insurance doesn't require a referral to do that, of course, insurance complicates all the things. So you could potentially go seek out a specialist on your own if you really do want to pursue that evaluation and you're not satisfied with the answer that you're getting from your child's pediatrician. It's definitely a good situation to kind of trust your gut if you feel like you're not being fully supported and there's a missing piece to the puzzle.
Yeah, and we say that just from our experience of talking to so many families when their kids are in 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th grade, where they've been told by family members and the pediatrician, like, they're fine, they're just boys, they'll grow out of it. And they're like at this place of like, they're not growing out of it, and it's actually moving in the wrong direction, where these behavioral challenges are actually getting worse, and they were functioning at school and now they're totally not. And, we're having these major issues. So again, early intervention and prevention is so helpful and important.
And we have a blog post that goes over all of your options for getting an assessment. So that really helps parents to parse out, like, this type of an evaluation, like a psychological evaluation versus neuropsych. There's pros and cons to a pediatrician assessment. And we really outline that in our blog post. So we'll make sure to put that in our show notes today so that if you are looking to understand more about the different types of evals, the cost, general cost of those things, and the pros and cons, you can easily use that as a reference. So for families who suspect ADHD, maybe they have a new diagnosis, what is something that they can do? Like, even if they don't necessarily have the diagnosis yet, or they're in the waiting game, I'm just thinking of parents who are listening who are like, okay, but yes to all of this. What is my next step? What do we recommend for them?
Yeah. So again, even if your child is getting a diagnosis at a young age of 4 and 5, we really recommend as kind of the first treatment for kids with ADHD is really those social behavioral interventions and parent training to help you gain tools to not only understand your child's brain, but understand what things you can do and change in the environment to better support them. Again, we always say it is not because you have done anything wrong in your parenting to cause this, but we do know that kids with ADHD have different, their brains are different and they require different parenting than typical kids. And a lot of the techniques that your friends are telling you to use or family is telling you to use aren't working for your child. And there's a reason for that because your child has ADHD. So we do recommend seeking support. So you can find a therapist that specializes in doing parent training for kids with ADHD or supporting young kids with ADHD. Again, at this young age, it's going to be a lot of working with parents to give them tools. Because if you have a child who's 4 and who's climbing everything and like trying to give them tools at this age just isn't really effective and they're not going to know how to use that. So it is a lot of working with parents. We also have a totally free parenting guide, 6 keys to parenting a happy and independent child with ADHD. We'll put that link in the show notes for you. So I definitely check that out. So that has lots of tips on effective parenting techniques. And we also have an online course, Creating Calm, all about parenting kids with ADHD from 4 to 12. And it's for parents of kids who are at risk for a diagnosis or don't have a diagnosis yet, to parents who have had that diagnosis for a while. And it's really just easy, simple, practical parenting strategies that you can implement today. So again, those are things that you can check out.
I love it. And I think our key takeaway today is just to really, as a parent, just trust your gut, to know that you know your child the best. I know my kids are the worst behaved at the pediatrician's office, but if your child goes to the pediatrician and is a perfect angel and you're like, no, really, I'm seeing these things and these are my concerns, don't get discouraged at that first roadblock. Know that, as a parent, you are the best advocate for your child. And so if there's anything you take out of today's episode, we just want to make sure that you know that you need to trust your gut and keep pushing until you get the answers that you need.
Thanks for listening to Shining with ADHD by your hosts, Lori, Katie, and Mallory of the Childhood Collective.
If you enjoyed this episode, please like this video and hit subscribe so you can be the first to know when a new episode airs.
If you are looking for links and resources mentioned in this episode, you can always find those in the show notes. See you next time.